pull up here. So Esther Merkes is a medical student in the final year of her general medical training at Radboud University in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. As part of her education, she's now working at various departments of neurology in Nijmegen. In 2016, she successfully investigated the variability of the long exercise EMG test in patients with periodic paralysis as part of a research internship under the supervision of none other than Bas Dunnenberg and Professor Baziel van Engelen. With her unique knowledge of periodic paralysis as both a patient and a budding physician, she is now poised to contribute to the clinical care of patients with periodic paralysis. After finishing her medical education in January, she's considering pursuing a career in neurology or public health, but we know she's going to go into neurology, right? So, come on up.
Thank you. So, thank you so much for having me. As I was already introduced, I'm Esther Merkes. And I am not only a medical student, but also a patient. And I did some research for periodic paralysis, so I think I decided to tell you something about all of these three things today, because I don't think there are that many doctors who are both a patient and a doctor and also a researcher. So I am from Nijmegen, which is in the Netherlands but not Amsterdam. It's close to the German border. And I wanted to tell you something about my life as a patient, and it's, for me, my science started when I was a little child. As you can see on this picture, I think it's pretty obvious. On the left side, I had some problems with my eyes. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was hard for me to keep them open. And on the right picture, I was feeling just fine. So I think that's the only material we have which I can show you from my time as a child. But I can remember playing on the ground, and my parents had to sometimes pick me up from the ground because I wouldn't be able to get up myself, or I would fall down to the ground again after being picked up. So it started, we don't know exactly when, but I think when I was around 3, 4, or 5 years old, something like that. And growing up, there was some trouble sometimes, especially as I played tennis. Each week I would play tennis and afterwards I would be paralyzed. So I did like playing tennis, and I was able to play a normal game or just train. But afterwards, when I would go home and sit on the couch, every week I would be paralyzed. And sometimes I had to play 2 games in a day, and that was quite horrific, because after the first game I would sit down, and then in the second game I would hardly be able to put my arm up above my head. So playing tennis would be very difficult. And also making tests in school is something I remember very well, because every time I would have to make a test, I would have trouble getting up afterwards, and I would see where the nearest toilet was and try to hide because I was ashamed. And in normal lessons I wouldn't really experience this, but every time I had a test, I was paralyzed afterwards, or weak at least. As a child we knew it wasn't totally normal, but we never really thought I might have a disease. I went to a doctor once, but he thought, well, I don't really know, and maybe you should get out of puberty first, and then we'll see again what might be wrong. But my life went on, and I decided to go to medical school because I really wanted to help people out, and that drove me to become a doctor. And in medical school, I realized that it is not normal to have the episodic weakness. And I was also getting quite afraid, because as a doctor you have to be able to help other people out, and I wasn't sure if I would be able to do that all the time. So that's when I decided to go back to see a doctor. and that's when the doctor sent me to a neurologist. And the neurologist didn't really think I had periodic paralysis at first, even though before I went to the doctor I read something about periodic paralysis, and because when reading it I was so certain, well, this must be it. I know this is what I have. So I told the doctor, I think I have hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, but the doctor didn't think so. So it was still a long run before I got my diagnosis. There were some blood tests done. There was an EMG test. I think on the next slide you can see the needle EMG showed some myotonic discharge. So that was a sign that there was definitely something wrong with my muscles. They also did a muscle biopsy which showed some vascular myopathy, so which was also a sign that there was probably something wrong. And in the end, genetic tests were done. This is also a picture of my EMG test. It's the long exercise test, which I will be coming back to because my research is about the long exercise test, but it was also explained, I think, yesterday. So in the long exercise test, it is shown that in the first 5 minutes, oh, you can't see it. In the first 5 minutes of exercise, my come-up went up, my CMAP, so my action potential over my muscle became higher, but after a longer time of rest, it was shown that my muscle got weak. So this also helped me get my diagnosis. And there is also a little video.
En weer terug. Blijf even staan en kun je misschien met wat steun proberen een tijdje zo te staan.
Yeah. So this was at one of my appointments, actually, when the genetic tests came back. So we already knew that they found a mutation in my sodium channel, but I also experienced some weakness during that appointment. So we also decided to test my potassium right away during the weakness and afterwards. So my potassium was up to 5 during the weakness, and in just 1 hour it went back to 3.9. So that was extra proof that I am suffering from hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. And well, I think it was nice for the doctors that I was at the appointment week that time, because at the previous appointments I was feeling fine. But of course it was so stressful to get the results from the genetic testing that I wasn't really surprised I was weak. Okay, so after being diagnosed, I found it to be quite a hard time. I was referred to several specialists, including the clinical geneticist, because I am the first in my family who has these symptoms. So we discussed whether we should test my parents or my family, but we decided not to, because the chances of them having periodic paralysis and having no signs at all are very small. So, well, we discussed that at the clinical geneticist office. I was also sent to a cardiologist, which I don't really understand, because I don't think there's a big chance of me having a heart problem as a hyperkalemic periodic paralysis patient, and luckily everything was fine, so that's good. I also saw a dietitian, because it's easy to say, well, try and minimize your potassium intake, but it's not so easy to do it. So I got a little help from the dietitian in knowing what I should eat or how I should do it. And well, I think it is helpful to have a specialist talk to you about it. I was also seeing a physiotherapist for quite a long time, because of the exercise as a big trigger for me, especially the rest after exercise. So I was in an extensive program where I learned how to exercise without being paralyzed afterwards. Having been paralyzed every time I have to exercise as a child, I kind of hated exercising. It was a very negative experience for me, so it was not so easy to get a positive vibe around exercising. But I think I'm doing much better now. I'm trying to work out without any peak load on my muscles, and I'm keeping my heart rate below 145 beats a minute. And for me that works out, so I'm now doing regular exercise without getting paralyzed afterwards. And I also saw a psychologist, which was very important for me. I think being diagnosed with a chronic illness at any age, but especially at a young age, is quite difficult. And I think everyone should be able to get some help with that. Luckily, I have some treatment which is helping me out right now. I take Diamox twice a day, 500 milligrams. I also take magnesium. I'm not sure why it's helping me as a hyper patient, but it takes away most of the pain I was experiencing. Sometimes I had pain in my muscles for days after I had been weak, and the magnesium helps with that. And during an attack, I try to take in sugar, so for example, dextro energy, which helps me make sure I don't get into full paralysis. I tried identifying my own triggers, and most of them are pretty common for hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. So as I already told you, rest after exercise is a big one for me. Stress really makes a difference. Not having breakfast soon enough, so being in a fasting state is a big one for me too. I've noticed that being tired makes it easier to get weak. Of course, potassium-rich foods, and for me a big one is sitting still for a long time. So in the morning, if I have a meeting, I always try to keep moving or go to the toilet after half an hour, or make sure that I don't have to sit still for a long time, because that's usually when I get weak in the morning. So as I already told you, right now I'm trying to exercise regularly, but without any peak load. I boil all my vegetables to keep the potassium as low as I can. And I try to keep moving. So if you want to get up, go ahead. What is scary for me is how the future might look. Of course, this is an autosomal dominant disease, so there's a big chance of passing periodic paralysis on to the next generation. I think that's quite scary, especially as we see that everyone can be affected differently. Even if you have the same mutation, we see that people are very differently affected, so that's pretty scary. And I'm also not sure what my attack rate will be like in the future, or if I will have permanent weakness, or if I will be able to be a doctor in the long run. So I think that's pretty scary. I also wanted to tell you something about how I see periodic paralysis as a medical student, because I think sometimes it's different than just being a patient. I know that it can be very, very frustrating to find the right diagnosis, and I know I was quite lucky to get my diagnosis within a year. But it can be so frustrating for both patient and doctors to keep searching and not finding the right diagnosis. And I think that even if you don't have a diagnosis, it's very important to realize that you are the only one who knows your own body. The doctor doesn't experience what you experience on a daily basis, and it's pretty difficult for a doctor to tell what your triggers might be, even if you have a diagnosis. So it's really important for you to identify your own triggers. It might help to keep a diary to identify triggers. I found this quite difficult as a patient, because I thought, what should I keep in my diary? There's so many things which might influence my strength. But for example, try to keep a diary about your diet for a month. And then if you see a pattern there, you can learn from it. And then the next month you focus on exercise, or the next month you focus on something else. Because I found it quite difficult to keep track of everything, because then all your life is about periodic paralysis, and I really didn't want it to be about that. But in the end, you are the one who can identify your own triggers. And also try to make sure you get the help you need. So even if you are not diagnosed, you might need help from different specialists other than a neurologist or a general practitioner, and make sure you get that help. For example, a psychologist. I started seeing a psychologist even before I was diagnosed, and it really benefited me, because having a chronic illness, even if it's not diagnosed, is so difficult. If you need help, make sure you get it, and don't be ashamed for needing help. And what I also wanted to say is that the main goal of a doctor is helping other people out. Sometimes it might not seem that way, but every single one who's doing med school with me wants to become a doctor to help other people out. So try and team up with your doctor. Don't start a fight or get caught up in an argument. Try to work together, and if something is very important for you, explain why it is important. Because if the doctor understands why something is important, I think all the doctor wants to do is help you and make sure you get the help you need. In this respect, I also wanted to say it is very difficult when a doctor says conversion disorder might be a diagnosis you would have, and I think it is very wrong to diagnose someone with it if it's not true. But conversion disorder is something which can be treated, and I think it is also not right if a doctor never thinks about conversion disorder, because people who do suffer from conversion disorder should be treated. So I think it's only wise that a doctor considers it. So don't hate your doctor for thinking about it, because if it would be conversion disorder, you might be able to get treated. So moving on to my research internship. It was only 3 months, so it was quite a small research project. But I tried to look at the reproducibility of the lung exercise test, the test we already talked about yesterday. So in the lung exercise test, I will explain again. You have to move your little finger outwards for 5 minutes as a exercise to make sure that in the resting phase after the exercise, your muscle might get weak, and the amount of decrease of your muscle strength is what is measured, and we call that the CMAP. It's the action potential over the whole muscle.
So there's no needles there, it's just a sticker?
Right, there's no needles needed. Yeah, it's all on the surface. And yeah, that's true. Yeah, the blue block is giving you signals, but it's, well, you can feel it, and some people say it might be a little painful, but I don't think it's really scary or something you shouldn't do because of the pain, but that's my personal opinion. The lung exercise test is already written about quite a lot in literature. For example, Fournier wrote about it, and he said that the lung exercise test might be that good that it could even help identify the mutation underlying the periodic paralysis, because they wrote about different patterns you can see in the weakness after the exercise in different mutations. So that's quite interesting. But we thought that even though the lung exercise test might be really good, no one ever really tried doing it multiple times in the same patient. So we're not sure if the result we see is really the result which belongs to a certain patient, or is just coincidental for that day. And that's what we wanted to look at. So we had 5 patients involved in the research, and they all had the lung exercise test performed 4 times in total. So we tried to keep all the everything the same, the same people doing the test at the same place, and we thought, well, let's see if we get exactly the same result each time.
Were you one of the patients?
I was, yeah. So I was one of the patients, and there were 4 other people. And as an outcome measure, there's kind of a cutoff line at 40% decline in CMAP. So if the muscle gets, well, it's not easy to say it gets weak for 40%, but it's kind of the measure we use. And if it's more than 40% decline, then we say it's a positive test. So these were the 5 people who participated. Unfortunately, most of them were using medication, which we thought might influence the results of the lung exercise test. But, well, it's not easy to say to people, well, just stop taking your medication because we want to do this trial. So, yes, I was. So these are my results. We did the lung exercise test 4 times. So on day 1 we tested both the left and the right hand, and on day 2 we also tested both the left and the right hand. And as you can see, my tests all ended positive, so they were all showing that I have periodic paralysis. And each time the maximum decrement was around 60%, so I still had 40% of the CMAP left, but it was a decrease of 60%. So we did make a graph of like this for all 5 patients, and if you combine those, we found this, which unfortunately shows that there's quite a range in results. So even though my results were pretty close together, patient 3, for example, had a really big range and had 2 positive tests and 2 negative tests. And patient 2, 4, and 5 all had all negative tests, even though they are genetically proven patients. So patient 2 and 5 were on medication, so that might be the reason why they tested negative. And patient 4 tested negative also 4 times, but she didn't have many attacks, so that might be the reason why, but we don't know for sure. And if you look at the range of these results, it's a mean of almost 30%. So the range, when doing it 4 times, is almost 30%. Interestingly enough, 3 of the patients also had a lung exercise test before they started using Diamox. And we thought, well, let's look at those results. And as you can see, before the red dots are before they were using acetazolamide. And as you can see, the higher you get, the more decrement you have. So the weaker you get. And without medication, they all had a bigger decrement than on medication. Of course, this is a small group, and there might be some day-to-day variability, but it's very probable that the acetazolamide did influence the results. So to conclude, we think that the results of the lung exercise test can range quite a bit when performed multiple times. So we found a range of 29.5% when doing it 4 times in these 5 patients. And that is pretty significant. But we also found that 4 out of 5 patients tested had the same result each time. So only one of the patients had a different result when retesting. So we think that when the result of the lung exercise test is negative, there's not a big chance that when you retest, you will get a positive result. And we also think that acetazolamide affects the results of the lung exercise test. So if you want to use it as a diagnostic instrument, people should not be using any treatment. So that was it for me, I think.
Oh, Esther, you should be really proud of yourself. That was like just a super presentation from all aspects. So I have 3 questions first. Since I have the mic, I can do that. So can the compound muscle action potential be an indicator of treatment success? Like, do you guys think? I don't, feel free also. Like, but I feel like if acetazolamide makes you better, then you should have a negative CMAP, which would be great. And if you are taking medicine and you still have a positive CMAP, it's an indicator that you probably could do better. I mean, and then might that be an indication to switch to something like dichlorphenamide? What do you think about?
Well, I think it could be an indicator that treatment is working or is not working well enough. But the main reason to do this research was to see if it's really a good indicator of the amount of weakness you get, and we saw that the variability is quite high. So if you just do the long exercise test and you see that there's less decrement of CMAP, but it's only a small difference, that can mean treatment is not working well, but it can also mean that the test is not, it's just not picking it up, or the variability is too high.
Well, I think that's a great study, and we often underestimate as physicians the variability of our test results, because if you do the same in, let's say, an EEG, we are used to repeat EEG once, two or three times in order to see a graph element. And I think I've learned in medical school, if I have a positive result, positive in the sense of a abnormal result, that provides evidence for my diagnosis. But a negative test result does not provide any evidence. It does not provide evidence that I'm wrong. It just does not add new information. Yeah.
But I mean, do you think that in terms of establishing whether someone is sufficiently treated, I mean, because that would kind of change how periodic paralysis is managed on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis. If you can objectively measure that you are substandardly treated because your CMAP remains positive, and when you're properly treated, the CMAP goes negative. But I don't know if that's something we can look into.
So let me say that I'm very proud of Esther's presentation, of course. So she did a great job, and she was quite humble, saying that our department was still doing okay, getting diagnosed in 1 year. Because when someone comes in and says, I've got my diagnosis, and at first someone else said, well, I'm not sure because you don't have flaccid attack, so probably it's not periodic paralysis, let's do muscle biopsy. But she already diagnosed herself, so we must be humble as a department as well. But it still took 1 year if someone comes in with the right diagnosis. So that's just one comment on the side. And the whole goal was because we also want to have a individual treatment outcome measurement. And so we wanted to see whether if we would switch you to another treatment, if we had some evidence of performing long exercise test on a couple of days during this switch in treatment, for example, or an N-of-1 trial. So I think if you look at the results, there is this variability, so maybe you should do not just one test at a certain time point, but you should do at least both arms. So you have some sense of variability. It is quite a long test of 60 minutes, but you can do both arms together if you're a bit trained probably as a lab, so that would be a nice step. And of course with the bumetanide, what Steve was talking about yesterday, the group from London are trying something different. They're trying to see if you can escape this decline in CMAP. So you provoke the attack and then see to a certain point where it declines, and then try to rescue the decline with a treatment at that time point. So then you're really using it as an in vivo treatment model. So that's really interesting, but also, again, if you have this variability that we see, we're trying to get the best in vivo model, of course, to do all things that Steve is coming up with and try to get it to patients, but sometimes you need something in vivo in between. So it looks quite promising, but you need to take into account the variability.
Yeah, sure.
So I also agree that was a terrific study. As you know, in the literature, they talk about the fact that although the sensitivity isn't as high as we would like it. In other words, there can be some patients who absolutely have periodic paralysis for whom on an individual day the test result is normal. On the other side, the initial reports, the McManus papers and so forth say the so-called false positives are essentially unheard of, where an individual without periodic paralysis would have this decline. I know that Dr. Griggs and Dr. Amato in Boston have said they've seen individuals where they thought they've seen a false positive, so I wonder if you've looked at that. It might be interesting to, because this is such a beautiful study, it's a very time-consuming test, and these data are hard to come by. You should study normal. You should get your mentor to do this test 5 times, I think, and he could be one of the normals.
I think in literature there is something written about testing normal people without any periodic paralysis. And I think even a Chinese study, which is quite big, tested like 70 patients, well, not patients, but people without periodic paralysis. And they found some people who even had a positive test result when retesting. And they couldn't really explain why, but it was just a few percent. So I think less than 10% had a positive result, which they couldn't explain really. But they did show it also in retesting. So it is possible that people who don't have periodic paralysis do show a decline in CMAP, and we don't really understand why. So yeah.
Just to finish on that point before asking a question, when we do diagnostic software, we very much have to struggle with these issues of where else is the test positive. And if in normal people you get a few percent, one might imagine in other neurological conditions one would even get a larger percent. And so getting that kind of information is going to be very important. But when you were showing your slides, you showed that one of the things you could do was some sort of snack called dextrose something or other. And I wanted to point out that when one says sugar or recommends to somebody to have sugar, it can mean 2 very different things. One is glucose, which is also called dextrose because it's D-glucose. And the other is sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose plus fructose. And it seems that the fructose is the most damaging part to one's metabolism and liver and so forth. And I was wondering whether there's some effort to get people to use just dextrose, which one can, I know in the United States you can now buy this at Whole Food stores, so that there's things labeled dextrose, and there's a bunch of reasons why not only the periodic paralysis community should be careful about avoiding sucrose, but particularly for people with hyper, for whom dextrose is for whom sugar of various sorts containing glucose is a rescue, that one should be very careful about large amounts that also contain fructose, and it might be good to recommend to people to try just with the dextrose, meaning glucose, which may be a better strategy.
That's interesting. Thank you. I've never heard about it.
Hi. I'm curious. You were talking about how tests are hard sometimes, or used to be. Like you sit down and do the test and not be able to stand up. And that must have played a part, like with brain fog and things, and caused possibly to do worse on tests. And I feel like that might happen to me and maybe other people in here too, is maybe adrenaline plays a part and all these things. So now that you know, is there anything you do? I mean, in medical school, I'm sure there are big tests that are kind of scary, and even presentations, like beta blockers or something that can, try to do proactive to prevent that?
That's a good question. First, I would like to state that I don't really understand why stress is such a big trigger for me, as I'm hyper. Right. So I don't really understand, but it's very, very typical. I always was weak after tests, so it must be something. And right now, what I try focusing on when doing a test is to keep moving. So even though I have to sit still, I make sure I have enough room, and I'm wiggling a bit on my seat, which is quite annoying because I should be focusing on the test. But well, that's part of living with periodic paralysis, I guess. I don't really use any medication for it, and I never really considered it.
Yeah, with hyper you wouldn't really need to because the adrenaline isn't something that...
Yeah, I'm not sure what part of it is the problem, but I do know that after starting Diamox, I got much better. So before every time I would sit down for a long time, so even if I would see a movie or would go through the theater, I would have a silly walk afterwards. So it was very typical, but right now I usually can get up without too much trouble. So it's much better on the Diamox.
Cool, thanks. Do hypers get brain fog too, or is that just a hypo thing? Hyper, yes? Okay, just...
I'd two things to say. One to Gabe about the exam thing. My son's just done, in the UK we have GCSEs at 16, they sit all their subjects all at once. So he's hypo, and he had some special arrangement whereby he was in a separate room from everyone else, so he could wiggle as much as he wanted. He could get up and walk around. He had a different chair from everyone else because they were sat on like collapsible picnic chairs, which is no use for him, and they had to sit for like good 2 hours each time, which is much longer than they do in class. He could have used a laptop if he had wanted to, because it's a lot of prolonged writing, or a scribe, but only if he had used that on a regular basis in school. And he had extra time because after a while his writing just like goes like slower and more spidery. And all of that was pre-arranged with the exam board before he started, so that might be a help. But I just wanted to ask you about your study, Esther. So I'm a doctor as well, and I was just wondering, you took a test that has been used routinely to look at periodic paralysis. We don't have many tests that are actual things that you can look at scientifically, and you basically seem to have blown it out of the water. In terms of variability, were you surprised that that happened? And having done that, obviously it was such a small study, have you spoken to a statistician about how many people you would need to do to show power in a scientific study to actually show that that was a problem?
Well, I was surprised how big the variability was, actually. I was really rooting for the test because for me it helped maybe even more than the genetic results in understanding that there is really nothing I can do when I'm weak. So the genetic test is nice and says, well, it's a channelopathy and there you have your diagnosis. But doing this test, I really saw, okay, so even if I don't do anything, I get weak and it's not my fault. So I really liked this test for that reason. But we did see that the variability was quite large, and I didn't speak to anyone about how many patients we would have to test. Because I think it would be hard to get that many people together and to take the time to do all those tests. No, I'm not sure how many people we would need, but I do think that the lung exercise test can still be used as a diagnostic tool. But maybe it's just not that solid as we might have thought it was.
Oh, hang on.
Before you throw the test out the window, shouldn't you keep in mind that all 5 of them were on Diamox? So they were better, they were at better strength than they would be without medication. So,
yes.
So maybe the test really showed that you can't use it when people are on medication because medication blurs the result. Mm-hmm. But you can still use it on people who are not on medication yet.
Yeah, it might be true, and it would be really interesting to do this research in patients only who are not treated. But I do think that the variability is not just a result of treatment, because the treatment was also quite stable. So I think it's not just the treatment, but it might very well influence the results. That's true, yes.
I'd like to make a comment on variability. We're hearing a lot about it. I mean, it's one of the key features of periodic paralysis. Just to say that I think there's very strong biology here. So we've heard, from parents and caregivers, this is not just my child doesn't want to go to school today. And interestingly, we see this in the mice. So every time we do an experiment, we do. Every time we do an experiment on the left calf and the right calf in completely separate baths, separate bottles, okay? There's no connection. And every animal has its quirky responses. So there's a funny oscillation, or it's a very profound attack or a mild attack. And the two muscles from the left and the right leg are always exactly the same. Although from mouse to mouse, it's highly variable. So there's a huge biology. This is not random chance. We don't understand it. I think it's a terrific opportunity to understand the fluctuations you are all experiencing. And we see this under conditions where we can absolutely control the potassium. It's in the bath. So potassium levels are important. You all want potassium monitors. But there are other things that are going on that's causing the variability. And we're trying to explore that biology. But it's a very real, robust thing.
And I think, by the way, the opportunity to study this, these conferences, we don't leverage it enough. I mean, you have like 50 to 100 people who come with periodic paralysis, many genetically identified, some not, so like, let's plan something for Florida. I don't know.
Just to say it's a wonderful presentation, particularly in your second language, and you'll be a wonderful doctor. And I've got two comments. One is there a gene linkage between wanting to study medicine and having periodic paralysis? Because statistically in here, this is getting ridiculous. There's at least 4 of us who are patient doctors. I know already from this room of 2 who are parent doctors. And we have one almost doctor and one who's either going to marry a bicycle or he's going to be a doctor. Anyway, I wonder if you can get this variability issue out into the open and published fairly widely, because I had a CMAP and I'm gene negative. So I've already been weaponized as being, no, you haven't got it, it's a conversion disorder. And my CMAP was 28%. Minus 28%, which the doctor who did it said, yeah, that's absolutely compatible with hypokalemic paralysis that goes with the Anderson-Tawil my cardiologist already said I had. But then that was shortly afterwards, there was a publication that said the cutoff is 40%. So immediately I was sort of weaponized again. So I sort of, and I cannot be alone in this. So, I mean, there are patients who constantly don't quite make the grade, but who have absolutely, barn door clinical story and, response to potassium. So I would just like to ask you to get this variability issue out there very rapidly. Because I think it would help a lot of us who've had one test that wasn't normal, but it wasn't abnormal enough, and it delayed my treatment for at least 9 months.
Thank you. We'll work on it.
I have a comment that's related to really both aspects of that, the previous question. In the neurology department at Children's Hospital in Boston, we had about 20 faculty members, and 2 of the faculty members had kids diagnosed with strokes after they were already faculty members. I think the reason was that we were just better at noticing something that would have been dismissed in one case as Bell's palsy, in other cases I'm not really sure. But I think part of it is that some of these things may be really more common than is generally appreciated. And as people with medical interests were better able to say, no, it's not just this really common thing. It is something unusual, and there may be cases where people have a milder case or something that's just, we're the ones who will persist and say it really is this, and really demonstrate that to the point where we can convince our colleagues. And on the subject of conversion disorder, there are real instances in which something is a conversion disorder, but my guess is it applies the other way. I have this fantasy of going through Freud's book on hysteria and coming up with clues that some of the cases were actually periodic paralysis. I've read through partway and gone through one of the cases, and I didn't see any sort of clear signs. But if anybody else reads through that book and finds things, I'd love to publish a paper together of sort of pushing in the other direction and saying, anytime you think of conversion disorder, ask yourself if it's periodic paralysis.
I have a question more relating to your first part of the presentation. I don't know if you're comfortable to share, but what when you saw the psychologist, what are the kinds of issues and strategies that they addressed, and how did they help? Were there specific problems that you asked about, or did they just kind of guide you? Because I know that there's a lot of folks here, especially the younger generation, and their parents would want to encourage maybe speaking to someone, because it's hard to deal with this.
I don't think it was a very special treatment. It was kind of just working through the fact that you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, and by that losing part of your future perspective of being a normal grown-up, and having to accept that there will be challenges in the future. I think that was the biggest part. It was just an acceptance problem. Not really a problem, because I think it's sometimes still difficult to accept that we are just different from other people. But I think the phase just after being diagnosed, and it was a difficult time, and it was just good to have someone to talk to who helped me understand that it was normal, that it was a difficult time, and that I should take all the time I need to be sad.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay. So I just
sorry, just on the thoughts about variability, it's probably a bit simplistic, but were the tests carried out at the same time of day, or was there variability there? Because I'm just thinking of people have eaten or not eaten or fasting, or would that affect the results? Mm-hmm. And just as a follow-up, maybe just the previous presentation about Dr. Lehman Horn, he always had the time of day. Maybe you could learn from that a little, you know. But just about the variability, had they eaten before or after? Or?
Well, we tried keeping all the circumstances the same, but it didn't work out in all the patients. So some patients were there on the first day in the afternoon and in the morning on the second day. But we did test both arms at the same, just after one another. And in all patients, we started the first test with the left hand and then the right, and then the next time we did the right first and then the left, just to see if that would make any difference. But we didn't really make sure they were all at the same time, or people would eat everything exactly the same each time. Also because in normal day, you can't really control that. So if people are coming in, they will be different each time, and I think we just wanted to see in a normal day practice what kind of variability would you see.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, so there's we're gonna have one more comment, and then there's some snacks outside, and I want to give time for Bas to do his thing.
I just wanted touch on the seeing like a psychologist while you're going through this chronic illness. It's just hard on like your family and yourself. So you talk about things like feeling guilty about, you know, messing up your family's day, or you know, they just give you coping skills. It's important to be with a psychologist that specializes in chronic illness and chronic pain. That might take you 3, 4, 5 counselors to go through to find one that you mesh with. But I think it's very, very important, and maybe even having all family counseling to, you know, touch on that and be able to learn how to speak with doctors so you don't get into the fights. So they give you communication skills, what to focus on in that area too. So I think that's very...
I saw a special neurologist, psychologist, so she was specialized in people with neurologic disorders, so that was really good. And I also came with my boyfriend a couple of times because it was also affecting him quite a lot, and I felt it would be good to work on it together, and it really helped a lot to go there together.
Awesome. Okay, guys, I apologize that there's more questions and stuff, but I think we should take 5 minutes, just a little snacks, maybe a diuretic break, and then come back.